Have you ever had a dream, maybe a memory from your childhood, so vivid that it almost has to be real? I'm not sure if this actually happened or not, but I've dreamed about it for the last 2 weeks, and I'm terrified that it will never stop. Whenever I close my eyes, it begins again, and each time, it's more vivid than the last. This isn't normal for me. Most days I couldn't tell you what I had for breakfast this morning, much less every detail of the dreams I had last night. But I can tell you every single detail of this event as though it happened just a second ago. It's the most terrifying thing that I've ever seen in my 30 years of life. And if it doesn't stop soon, I don't know what I'll do. I was 8 years old when I knew what terror really was. Miss Winkler was teaching us math, her blackboard covered in numbers and mathematical symbols, when my hand came up, my chubby fingers tickling the sky in anticipation. She'd been trying to engage us for about 45 minutes, enticing slivers of answers out of kids who'd rather be playing outside or pretending to be Power Rangers. When my hand came up, she looked so hopeful. Maybe she thought she had finally reached a student, perhaps. Maybe she thought she'd finally had a breakthrough, and a student would begin to return her answers to her. When she called on me, I can still see the hopeful smile that stretched her painted lips as she said my name with great expectation. Unfortunately, I was about to break her heart. "Can I go to the bathroom, Miss Winkler?" I asked in my high, innocent voice. Her face fell, and as an adult, I can understand that disappointment. "Yes, take the Hallpass when you go." The Hallpass was a ruler with the word Hallpass written on it in magic marker. It was smudged from many dirty hands, and as I took it up and left the room, my adult mind wondered how many other hands had touched it over the years. As a kid, all I had wondered about was whether or not I could use it as a convincing lightsaber. I suppose kids do have different priorities, don't they? I swished and buzzed it all the way to the bathroom, and as I came up to the squat little building, I felt nothing besides a need to pee. The brick building was large enough to hold 2 bathrooms, a boys' and a girls', and 4 students comfortably inside each. I remember it being cold and damp in the winter, but I thought it would be mercifully cool on this blistering summer day. As I pushed the door open, I felt cold air ruffle my hair. Today, though, something didn't feel quite right about this place. The darkness was oppressive, pervasive, and even as a child I could feel that something was different. I reached inside and groped for the light switch. My hand slid over the slimy walls but found nothing. I knew there should be a light switch here, but as I scrambled my hand over the moist tiles, I became more and more aware of how badly I needed to pee. I finally decided to just go use the stall in the dark, the dingy windows letting in enough light that I wouldn't be in complete darkness. The door swung shut behind me. I felt the air pull it closed very hard, and the sound echoed off the bathroom walls. The dingy windows showed me 2 urinals and 2 walled-off toilet stalls. I went into one of the stalls, always feeling more comfortable sitting down to use the bathroom, and got comfortable as my bladder began to empty itself. As I started to do my business, I became aware of the strange noise from the stall next to me. The stalls were made of concrete blocks, painted glossy white, but they were not entirely built into the floor. There was a small opening at the bottom, about a foot high, where you could see into the stall next door. As I sat in the greasy semi-light, I heard the sound like mud dripping onto the floor. Every 5 seconds, it would glop, glop, glop onto the floor. Underneath the sound was another, softer, wetter, heavy breathing that was so low it was almost inaudible. I had finished using the bathroom by this point, but the sound mesmerized me. I had never heard anything like it, and I was fascinated and terrified to see what made a sound like that. Slowly I bent down so I could look under the wall, too afraid to simply go open the stall and see what was in there. As my knees bent to the cold concrete and my hands splayed over the rough floor, I brought my eyes down to peek and saw something that I will never forget. If it was dingy dark in my stall, then it was nearly pitch black in the other. As my eyes adjusted, I could see something on the other side that looked like nothing so much as rippling mud or swaying pudding. It was a mass, a wiggling mass of something that nearly blocked out the entire opening. As I watched, it rippled and shook endlessly as the sound of wet, labored breathing only got louder. Before long, it was more than background noise. It covered the dripping gloop with its damp and difficult chorus. I couldn't look away. I couldn't drag myself away from it until something round and angry floated through the muck and seemed to see me seeing it. It was an eye. I was up in a heartbeat, legs drawn up to my chest as I sat on the toilet and clutched myself. I held the ruler to my chest like a makeshift weapon and tried to silence my growing terror as the breathing became growly and agitated. The door burst open on the other stall, and I thanked my lucky stars that I had remembered to lock the door to my own cubicle before starting my business. Whatever was on the other side banged against the door. It sounded like waves crashing against a levee, and all I could do was cower and try not to scream, worried it might excite the creature and push it to further violence. It slammed in again and again, and as it did, I almost thought I could feel flecks of whatever it was made of slapping off and splatting on the ceiling and floor. It battered the door mercilessly, and to my horror, I could see the simple slide lock joggling and shuddering under every blow. The sound it made was like a mudslide, like mud pushing its way through a hallway during a flood, and I just knew that any minute it would break the door and cover me. Then it stopped. Whatever it was gave one final slap against the door, and then rumbled off out of the bathroom. I sat petrified, unable to move for nearly 5 minutes, before I finally found myself able to control my shaking legs. It was gone. Whatever it was gone, but I wanted it to be gone and well gone before I decided to come out. The lock didn't want to open, but it popped open after a few hard slaps with my hand. The door creaked outward on warped hinges, and I could tell that the cubicle door was definitely going to need replacing. As I turned to look at it, I could see several dark stains on the outside where something had slammed its soupy body into it again and again. Something dripped onto my shoulder, and my scream peeled off the walls like a startled bird. I scuttled back on crab legs. My knees had buckled, and I watched as something thick and muddy dripped off the ceiling and fell onto the cracked tile. I looked up to see a dozen or more little stalagmites, or maybe they were stalactites, hanging from the ceiling. They oozed and threatened to fall, their creation having taken place very recently. At that moment, all I wanted to do was get out, to escape, but I should have known that it wouldn't be that easy. When I pushed the door open, it didn't swing out onto the yellowing grass of my school sports field, but onto a shadowy hellscape of swirling lights and acrid smells. My child's mind didn't understand everything, didn't even understand some of the things, but it did understand that there were many moving mountains out there that made the one in the bathroom look like an anthill. The smaller ones congregated around towering fires, the dusty brown earth scraped shiny by their passing, and around them seemed to grind mountains that towered up into the greasy sky. Their tops were illuminated by infrequent forks of lightning. I could see towering rock sentinels made of ever-flowing viscous earth. It was too much. I closed the door and crumpled into a corner between the dripping sink and the wall. I made myself as small as possible. I felt as a bug must feel when it's surrounded by humans, and as my mind tried to process what I had seen, I seemed on the verge of breaking. How could I process something so big without going insane? The smallest of them had been barely able to be contained by this building. The largest of them could have destroyed this building without thinking. My mind could not fathom the sheer size of them, the knowledge of these moving mountains, so I did the only thing I could to keep myself from going insane. I put myself to sleep. The janitor found me there, and when he touched my shoulder, he said I fought and screamed like a cornered animal. He didn't mind, though. He was glad he had found me. It was night when he took me out of the little toilet building, and he had to be very firm with me to get me to go outside into the gloom. I was afraid it was a trick. The dark reminded me of the greasy blackness of that place, and it wasn't until my mother saw us coming out and ran to me that I knew I was back where I belonged. They took me to the principal's office. My dad, my teacher, the principal, the police officers, they were all waiting there for me. My dad hugged me, folding me into his warm embrace, and my teachers and principals asked me where I had been. When the janitor said he had found me in the toilet, my teacher seemed confused, and the police seemed aggravated. "You said you searched the entire school," said the principal. not just to my teacher, but also to the police officers. We did. We even brought the dogs in. There's no way that kid's been in the bathroom for 2 days. My face must have shown how confused I was as I tried my best to follow the explanation. They told me I'd been missing for 2 days. The school had been searched, a code Adam had been ongoing, and they had searched every place I liked and every friend's house I'd ever been to. I tried to tell them about the monsters, about the weird world full of giant things, but they just shook their heads and said I must have been hiding this whole time. I think my parents were just happy that I was safe, and the principal didn't punish me, even though I sensed that he really wanted to. I think my teacher believed me when I told her I wasn't hiding, holding the Hallpass out to her in a shaky hand. She knew I was a good kid, and didn't usually cause more than the average 8-year-old's amount of trouble. She quit the next year, and I was removed from her class at my parents' request. When she saw me in the halls after that, I could swear that she looked almost sad to see me. I haven't thought about that place in years. After it happened, my parents took me to see a psychiatrist, and she helped me put it out of my mind. I would only remember it sometimes in the dark hours of the night, but it was gone just as quickly. Even though it comes back in vivid detail, and I don't know how much longer I can handle it. I see the mountains moving as I stand in the doorway of that bathroom. I know that they will end me if they see me. I know that if they see a way to our world, they will end all of us. And I'm afraid of what I'll see the next time I open that door. I'm not sure which was weirder. The fact that Dad had a hole in his head, or the fact that he was just so unimpressed with it. Dad had come home from his job at the steel mill, just as he had 1,000 times. We heard him sit his hard hat down by the door as he stripped out of his jumpsuit before coming to dinner. Mom had meatloaf on the table with potatoes and peas, Dad's favorite, and we waited patiently for him to arrive like we always did. If this sounds weird to you, that's because it should. Dad had a strange idea that he should go to work, Mom should stay at home and keep the kids, and that everyone should look like an episode of Leave It to Beaver when he got home. I remember for a while, Mom met him at the door with a cold glass of beer when he came home. He eventually told her to stop so that the dust from the mill didn't get on her. It was odd, but Dad paid the bills, and that's how we liked it, so that's what we did. Mom had gotten half of her welcome home greeting out before it curdled in her throat. My brother had already seen it, but I was still looking at the TV around the corner and hadn't seen it yet. MTV was playing a song by a band I liked, and I looked up at Mom to ask if I could use the bathroom when I noticed Dad's head. Dad, meanwhile, had sat down at the table like nothing was amiss, opening his napkin and putting it on his lap. He was hungry from a day at work, and he had just started asking us about our own day when he noticed our horrified looks. What? What's the matter? All three of us were speechless for a moment. How did he not realize what had us all so gobsmacked? Surely he had to feel that. He had to realize what had happened to him. There was no way that a person could be so oblivious of something like that. In the center of Dad's forehead was a hole big enough to stick your pinky finger into. It wasn't like a wound. Wounds usually bleed or appear red or scabby. This one was simply a black hole in his forehead. The edges looked a little ragged, but that more reminded me of a hole that someone had drilled into the pavement than a wound. As strange as the hole was, the fact that it didn't seem to have an exit point was even stranger. "Honey," Mom asked, trying to be diplomatic about the situation, Did something happen at work today?" "No," Dad said, looking at her speculatively. "Well, Stubbins was changing the no-slip grating on the walkways, but that's really not that weird, I guess." Are you sure nothing odd happened today?" she asked, trying to tiptoe around the matter so she didn't upset him. Sometimes Dad could have a temper, and none of us wanted to see it. "I guess, maybe," he seemed to think about it. "There was this guy I bumped into on the sidewalk. I fell down, and he helped me up, but it was nothing." When she continued to look at him skeptically, he set his fork down angrily and glowered at her. "Look, Martha, if you have something to ask, then just go ahead and ask it. I'm trying to eat here." "Dad, there's a huge hole in your freaking head." I was never what you'd call subtle. Dad wrinkled his eyebrows at me. "What in the hell are you talking about?" "There's a hole in your forehead. How do you not feel that?" "Are you trying to be funny? 'Cause you know I don't like jokes." Despite his gruff tone, though, he began feeling around his forehead, as if trying to find the source of discomfort. He seemed half-hearted, like he was just doing it as a favor, by looking at it in the first place. But when his fingers touched the ragged edges of the hole, he shuddered a little. I didn't think it had hurt him, not really. It was more like the shudder you get when you have an itch and you scratch it. He inspected it with his fingers for a moment before getting up to look at it in the bathroom mirror. The three of us hovered just outside the door as he looked at it in the mirror, and we must have looked like some old comedy routine as we waited for his prognosis. After a few minutes of poking and prodding at it, he finally turned away and walked past us, leaving us just standing there. We found him at the kitchen table, eating his dinner like any other night. "Sit down. Your mother's meatloaf is getting cold," he told us, once he noticed we were there. "Dad," I started, but Mom put a hand on my shoulder. "Harold, there's a hole in your head. Don't you think we should go to the hospital?" Dad turned his emotionless gaze on her, making it clear that he didn't want to talk about it. When we didn't move, he growled in his throat in a deep, phlegmy way. "Doctor won't be able to do anything but poke at it and charge me an arm and a leg. Not going to no doctor. Now sit down and eat." Then he went back to eating, ignoring us until we returned to the table and ate as well. We all tried not to notice the hole as we ate, but it was hard to ignore. As we sat and watched TV that night, the TV screen seemed to reflect off that dark hole. Mom laughed every time the audience did, but Dad never did. Well, that's not entirely true. Dad did this thing when he found something funny. 1 part chuckle and 9 parts phlegmy rumble. When I was a kid, I had asked Mom once why Dad never laughed or smiled, and she told me that he laughed often and smiled daily. "It's just hard to tell with your father. He's not quite as obvious about it as the rest of us are." After that, I started paying more attention to Dad, and I'd come to the point where I could pick up on the subtle twitches at the corner of his mouth, the gravelly rumble when he chuckled, the minute crinkling at the edges of his beetle-black eyes. They helped me tell when my dad was in a good mood, and when he felt less like hitting and more like patting, when you could ask him for a favor, when it was best to leave him alone. It was a talent my younger brother never learned, and it was a mistake that often earned him a cuff upside the back of the head when he'd try to hit Dad up for money. Dad was enjoying the byplay tonight as Raymond bemoaned everything from his mother to his job, but my mind was still firmly fastened on the hole. As I watched it, I almost fancied that I could see it expand and retract as though it were breathing. I told myself it was the light from the TV, but the longer I watched, the surer I became that it was moving. It was like a ragged mouth, pulling in and pushing out air. It was subtle, like my father's moods, and the longer I watched, the more apparent it became. When my father turned his gaze on me, I realized he had caught me staring. "Either go to bed or stop staring at me. You're creeping me out." I pushed off the love seat and went to my room. I knew I wouldn't be able to focus on anything as long as that hole was on display. The next few days were uneventful, I guess, but I noticed that Dad started wearing a hat when he went outside. I wished he would wear it inside, too, because the hole seemed to always be watching me whenever I was around him. It wasn't, of course, because it didn't have any eyes, but I could feel that itchy feeling you sometimes get when someone's staring at you. It looked like it was getting bigger, too. But if it pained Dad, he didn't say anything about it. He mostly ignored it, his only exception to ignoring it being the hat he wore outside. Dad was stubborn, but he wasn't foolish. Dad was a sensible person who liked to keep attention off himself. Over the next 10 days, the hole got noticeably bigger. When we'd first seen it, it had been maybe big enough to put your pinky finger inside. Now I could have easily put several in there, and still he refused to go to the hospital. Mom tried to coax him, but he said it wasn't worth bothering a doctor over. If it was bad, it would hurt, and it doesn't. If it means to go away, it'll do it on its own. He went to work, came home, watched TV, and all the time that hole continued to grow. I found myself looking at my father more and more often, that gaping chasm seeming to look at me, even when his hat was on. I started having dreams about that hole, and in my dreams it oozed and bled, and a single eyeball rolled around to look at me. No matter what Dad was doing in the dream, that eye stared at me until I came awake, gasping. Then one day, he came to breakfast, and the hole had taken in his eyebrows. It wasn't a hole now, it was more like a pit, a crater, that just so happened to sit in the middle of my father's head. Mom was left with an egg halfway to her mouth as she stared into that gaping void. We could all see it breathing now, the push and pull of its respiration as it drew in its terrible breath. Dad sat eating his own eggs and grits, pretending like nothing was wrong, but it was clear that he felt it too. He refused to answer any of us when we called his name, and left for work with his breakfast only half eaten. I noticed that when he came home from work that day, there was a different hard hat on the table in the entryway. The hard hat had a slant to it and would better cover the hole. Dad may act like nothing was wrong, but I couldn't. I started avoiding him. I would come down to breakfast late since I knew he'd be at work. I would make excuses to stay out so I could miss dinner. I did any number of other things to avoid being in the house, but it hardly seemed to matter. I had begun to hear some kind of strange whispering as I lay in bed at night, and it permeated my dreams as the eye inside began to whisper words I didn't understand. The words were alien, harsh, and unwantable, but I felt I knew their meaning. My sleep became as ragged as my father's moods, and if I hadn't been barely into my senior year of high school, I think I would have moved out. Then about a month and a half after the spot appeared, Dad didn't come down for breakfast. Mom told us that Dad wasn't feeling well. She said he must have gotten sick in the night, but the way her eyes looked told me something beyond sickness was at play. He didn't go to work that day, and unknown to us, he would never go back to work again. Mom moved into the guest bedroom, and I wouldn't find out till later it was because Dad had locked the door and wouldn't let her in. We could hear him in there bumping around. Mom would leave food in the hallway, but we never saw him take it. This went on until one morning when I forgot my notebook upstairs. I'd been heading to school, leafing through my bag, when I realized I'd forgotten my biology notebook. I had a test that day, and I wanted to study before class. I was halfway up the stairs when I heard the door to my parents' bedroom open. I stopped halfway up, not sure whether I should continue or not. None of us had seen Dad since he went into hiding, and my brother and I had been very curious about what was happening with the hole. I put my fingers on the carpet and scrambled slowly up the stairs, peeking over the edge of the stairs as I heard the scrape of silverware being bumped. I could see my father's back, clad in a bathrobe and knee socks, as he bent over for the day's breakfast tray that my mom had left for him. He seemed to be having trouble grabbing it, and his hands threatened to knock over the juice that she had set beside the bowl of oatmeal. Then he stood up, and I had to put my hand over my mouth as he came into view. The top of his head looked like nothing so much as one of those cartoon holes they used to trap each other. It was a swirling black vortex that looked a mile deep, and as he turned to go back into the room, I could see the hole was like some kind of optical illusion. It was exactly as deep on the other side as it was on the back. He turned and took the tray back into the bedroom, but when he bumped the tray on the corner of the door, I realized why we had heard him banging around so much the last few days. In my dream, the hole always had an eye, but in reality, it had stolen my father's sight. The dreams became different after that. Every night I dreamed that my family was eating around the breakfast table. My brother sat on my left, my mom sat on my right. Dad sat across from me, bent over his breakfast as usual. They all sat eating food from a massive pile, their breakfast more like a buffet. I seemed to be the only one paying attention to the strange creature wearing father's clothes, and the food he ate was pushed into the circle hole atop his head. As I watched, the eye emerged again, but it wasn't alone this time. The eye was in a face, and the face was long and terrible. The skin was tan and leathery, like a hide left out in the sun too long. The hair was white and fine like a corpse's. The teeth were jagged and yellow, its eyes the cataract threads of the chronically blind, and when its face rolled around to look at me, I would shake as its lips rose in an almost comical grin. As everyone ate, the mouth opened and a low whisper began to assault my ears. Every night, that whisper became a little louder, and over time, I came to understand the words. Shally shally may ray, fori fori may gra, lee raleigh grega, su raleigh drema. The words slid into my ears like slugs, coating my brain in the forbidden knowledge they possessed. I wasn't sure what the dream meant, but I knew that they were meant for me. Was this the thing that had been staring at me the whole time? Was this the reason I had felt watched? As the dreams continued, I began humming or reciting the words that spoke to myself during the day. I would catch myself making little rhymes out of it, and they were never far from my mind. It was almost soothing to speak those words, a balm to the terrible dreams and the terrible fear that wormed its way through my mind. I knew what it wanted me to do, and one night, I did my part. I needed to use the bathroom in the middle of the night. my bladder full to bursting. I was leaving the bathroom when I noticed that the door to my parents' room was open for the first time in a long time. There was a noise coming from inside, and it sounded pained. I thought maybe one of the dogs had gotten in there and gotten hurt, but I think even then, I knew what I would find. Dad was on the ground, his swirling head practically hyperventilating as it pulled in and out. The swirls had taken in Dad's shoulders and the top of his chest. He was lying on the floor, flopping around as his arms protruded from the vortex. I reached down and helped him sit with his back to the bed. He couldn't talk, probably couldn't even see, but he seemed to understand that I was there to help him. As I looked at the swirling mass, though, I felt the words come to my lips. I don't know if they were intentional, but I know they were the words that needed to be said. Shali Shali Rema, Fori Fori Megra, Li Rali Grega, Su Rali Drema. As the words fell from me, I saw something swirling in the mass of shadows. I was worried it would be the huge eye, like the one I'd seen in my dreams, but I was even more afraid that it would be the ancient face that I often saw amidst the vortex. As it swirled and thrummed, I could see the white hair beginning to sprout from the depths. The head was coming on fast, and as those eyes emerged from the depths, I could see the corners cast up in a smile. My shaky legs took me away from him with small, stuttery steps. His face came free of the murk, but it wasn't done yet. As his head slid free, a withered form emerged beneath it. He was naked, looking like some kind of wizened mummy, as his leathery skin slid from the dark pool. Below the dark pit that had made up my father's head, his body began to shrivel up like a 4th of July firework, becoming blackened embers before my eyes. The more of that evil thing that came free, the less of him there was, and when his withered feet touched down on the soft carpet of my parents' bedroom, what remained of my father simply blew away. The old man reached down for the grubby bathrobe that Dad had been wearing, and tittered as he pulled it around himself.
Took you long enough, but I guess I can't be upset. You and your father have served me well, though you never realized you were doing it. Your reward is not sharing in his fate. Your punishment is knowing you are responsible for my return to this world. What you do with these gifts is up to you.
Then he left, just walked out of our house and into the night. As the sun comes up over my mother's kitchen, I realize I've been writing this since I managed to get back to my feet and walk shakily down the stairs. I've been trying to write down as much of this experience as possible, so I won't forget any of it. But it's so weird, and it's hard to put it all into words. What the hell was that thing that ultimately killed my father? Did it make the hole in his head? Why him? As I sit here watching the sun come up, I realize I may never know. I was speechless when she sent me the message. Even her text looked sexy in the pink curly writing she used. It was short and sweet and to the point, but it still filled my chest with a tightness that wouldn't go away. At the time, it was a dream come true. Meet me at the Hotel Aries at 11 p.m. Don't be late. I couldn't believe this was happening. Tonight, I would meet with Lady Dragora. I guess you could say I have a slight problem with weird fetishes. I discovered pornography when I was young, like most people I know. I was 12, I was horny, and someone I knew said I could find boobs online if I looked. I dived headfirst into a well I don't think I really understood the depths of. It started with generic stuff, naked photos, short clips from films, and led to my current level of kink. I started slow, it was the 90s after all, and internet connections were not what they would become. I have waited all day for a single picture to load, only to be disappointed when the phone rang and everything was lost. Most of my early burgeonings were done in chat rooms, in the steamy squares of private messages. With both of my parents away at work, I was on the computer every day after school. I didn't discover my proclivity for vor until I was in college. When you've been cruising the web for as long as I have, you eventually find yourself into some offbeat stuff. You can't experience that much depravity and not be changed fundamentally, and I was no different. I had recently grown bored with my selection of smut and went looking for something different. When I found Vor, though, I knew I had found something special. Vor, if you're unfamiliar, is a fetish that centers around eating or being eaten by something. In the community of niche communities, Vor is pretty niche. I belong to several online communities where we discuss the acts and the aftermath and trade images online. But I only know a few people in my area who are into it. We meet up once a week to have coffee and gush over our favorite Vor videos and whatnot, and gush over our local legend, Lady Dragora. Lady Dragora was a legend in the Vor scene. She had a subreddit devoted to her videos, a Snapchat full of fans who hungered for her next performance, and a legion of fans willing to pay exorbitant fees for her live shows and recordings. She wouldn't tell people her age, but most of us guess she's in her 30s. She has this long, dark hair that falls in straight waves of ebony silk, and her eyes hold the slight hint of some Asian parentage, maybe. She's beautiful, she's exotic, and she was a total sadist. Lady Dragora made the kind of videos that were illegal everywhere. She made the sort of videos that came with a price tag payable in cryptocurrency. I had seen other so-called Vor videos before her, but many were obviously fake, obviously staged, or obviously CGI. People would eat mice only to have a jump cut before they started chewing. They would dangle CGI mice over their gaping maws. They would pretend to eat things or eat things they were pretending were alive. And after a while, it just becomes a little old. Her videos were something different. The first video I ever saw involved her eating a rat the size of her hand. The video opened on a terrarium full of squirming rats, not mice, sewer rats. And as she approached the tank, they all began to go wild. They ran over the top of each other, squealing in pure terror. It was as though they sensed a bigger predator coming and wanted to be sure her eyes didn't fall on them. She was dressed in what would become her signature black bodice, garters, black choker, black elbow-length gloves, and long leather knee-high boots. Some videos seemed to require music laid over the top, but not hers. When she reached inside the tank, you could hear the rats screaming and flailing inside as they tried desperately to avoid her hand. She selected one of them and pulled him out with a gloved hand. The rat squirmed and kicked, visibly distressed by her, but she paid him no mind. She replaced the lid and walked away from the tank with the screaming rodent. Their cries were high-pitched, almost pig-like, and you could hear them off camera in low waves. The video cut to her, holding the rat up to the camera, still squirming and biting as it struggled to free itself. She held it too tight in her clenched fist, and its fur seemed to boil around that fist like water overflowing a glass. I expected a jump cut when she opened her mouth and leaned over the rat's head. It screamed pitifully as her teeth encircled its writhing head. He bit at her, lashing out with those sharp teeth, but if she felt it, she seemed not to notice. It spasmed as her teeth began to close around its head, and I watched, thinking to myself that the jump cut would be any minute now. This will be when the video jags, and her teeth will close around a plastic rat. She'll be just another pretender, just another charlatan, just another... The blood flowed out as the rat made its final scream. Her teeth sank into it and tore at its skin. When she came away, she was chewing, and the rat's body twitched in her hand as she ate. The twitching stopped before she went back for another bite, but the blood made a macabre sort of fountain as it ran down her gloved fingers and pattered to the floor. She ate the whole rat, one bite at a time, bones and all, and as the tail disappeared down her throat, I was hooked. I'd probably watched about a dozen of her videos before I dared to show anyone. Sometimes she bit, which was hot, but sometimes it seemed that she would just swallow whatever she was eating whole. She'd worry it down with very little difficulty, her throat bulging as whatever it was slid down, and to me, That was more erotic than the chewing. It wasn't just rodents either. Eels, mice, more rats, chicks, they all went down her throat, while my friends and I paid $79.99 a video. 2 months ago, she put a small camera on a mouse and swallowed it whole while videoing its descent into her stomach. The camera must have cost her quite a bit. Between the size of the camera, the night vision interface, and the video's price, I knew it wouldn't be something we could expect often. The footage changed the way I'd viewed my fetish. Watching something struggle in her stomach, watching its final moments, was far more intimate than watching her swallow it whole. I told her as much on the comment section of her website. I spilled my guts to her, hoping to impress her, and somehow it worked. I wish I knew what would come of that stupid comment. I was shocked when she responded. I'd been sitting at the coffee bar with the other members of our group, Doug and Matt and David. We were all discussing the latest video by Lady D when my phone chirped loudly. I looked down to check it and saw a banner informing me that Lady Dragora has responded to your comment. I almost spewed hot coffee on Doug before opening the message and reading what she'd written. The guys leaned in close, wondering what I'd seen to garner such attention, and when he saw the sender, he too almost spit coffee in surprise. I opened her message, and it said 8 short words. How profound. I would love to chat sometime. Dave whistled through his teeth. Wow, she rarely talks to fans. You're in, man. And so I was. As they sat crowded around me, I answered her, and she immediately began our strange correspondence. I didn't question it at the time, but the speed with which she picked up our conversations should have triggered a red flag or two. It was as though she were just waiting for me to respond, waiting for her prey to wander into her field of influence so she could snap the trap shut and watch it squirm. For 3 months, we chatted almost every day. We talked about everything. Music, food, the usual getting-to-know-you stuff. We eventually made it to topics that were a little more personal. It turned out that she held some strange beliefs about life force, believed that consuming the flesh of living creatures would give her their life force and extend her own life somehow. I asked her if she'd ever eaten human flesh, but she just joked that maybe I'd find out someday and danced around the subject. The more I talked to her, the more I became certain that she had traveled much and knew things that I could only guess at. She spoke about distant places and strange customs. If I hadn't been so enchanted by the attention of a celebrity, I might have seen the numerous red flags she was putting up. She talked a lot about places you didn't see on the Travel Channel, sites that didn't have names you could scrawl across a map, locations both ancient and remote. A month ago, she asked me if I would roleplay with her. I agreed, of course, because I was hooked on her attention. Even in my haze of glamour, though, I knew there was something a little off. Her persona was that of a large reptile, and mine was always of some prey animal fit only for ingestion. She would describe my end, my passing between large and ancient lips, and my slow descent towards the transition into nutrition. I would describe my struggles, my vain attempts at escape, but she would always catch me and describe in loving detail my demise at her jaws. I loved it. After all, this was my thing, and I often walked away from our sessions with a bounce in my step. People probably had a hard time understanding how someone achieves satisfaction at the idea of being devoured, but to me, it was no different than any other obsession. We would roleplay twice a week, her scenarios and story threads becoming darker as they went, and before long, she wasn't just swallowing me whole, but tearing into me and getting a little violent. I was less on board with these instances. Imagining myself going through these pains were never my thing, but she always smoothed it over with personalized videos or custom works just for me. She made me feel special, made me feel accepted, and that's what made it easy to draw me in. This was also when I was approached by Justin. His screen name was Furrylocks on the board in question. Until he messaged me, I'd never even heard of him. though it seemed we moved in similar circles. My only correspondence with him was a message left in my inbox one morning. It was hastily written, full of spelling errors, and intrigued me to no end. I read it twice before class, and when I showed it to my friends in the Vor group, they brushed it off as a jealous fan. His message was not long, but it did make me question some rumors I'd heard on some of the other boards. It read, "You don't know me. My name is Justin. I understand that you've become close with an internet personality known as Lady Dragora. I don't know how much you know about her, but she may or may not be 100% what she seems to be. I had a friend whom I'd known since grade school. He caught the attention of the lady, and it was the happiest I'd ever seen him. Their relationship was brief, a month or two. Then one night, he told me she'd invited him to her hotel room. I didn't think anything of it until he didn't respond to my calls or texts for 2 days. He's been missing for 3 months now, and your new lady friend has either blocked me or refused to respond to any of my messages. I'm not trying to turn you away from your current relationship, whatever that might entail. I'm simply trying to warn you to be on your guard." I was hesitant to respond. It seemed better to just ignore him. But after a particularly grisly RP session a week later, I decided to message him and get some information. I was still very much under her spell, but some of our conversations had made me wary. After all, she was still a stranger on the internet. Growing up at an age of stranger danger, I was very wary of people online pretending to be someone they weren't, a collection of online videos or not. However, my message was never opened, never read, and when the invitation to her hotel room came across my box, I decided to put my fears aside and go for it. That's how I came to be in her hotel room at 11 p.m. She sent me the text around 6 in the afternoon. "Meet me at the Hotel Aries at 11 p.m. Don't be late," was all it said, but it was enough to get my blood running hot. The Hotel Aries was not a huge hotel, but it was one of the largest in this part of Chicago. The borough of Chicago was an hour from campus, but I drove the distance gladly. If she told me to drive to New York that night, I'd have done it. And with the invitation being so close to home, I decided I would be a fool not to accept. I told my friends from the coffee shop where I was going. They told me to take some video and let me know when they got home. I set out for the hotel in high spirits, my mind flooded with possibilities. I had arrived early, 2 hours early, hoping that maybe we could have a meal before whatever was going to happen tonight. I inquired at the front desk, and the man behind the counter gave me a knowing little smile as he slid the key card across to me. "She's gone out for a little while, but she mentioned that she likely had a guest coming tonight." "Have fun," he said. I started up to the elevator, wondering how often he'd had to do this for her. How often did she have guests? I took the elevator up to the penthouse and found a lavish one-bedroom suite decked out in rich fabrics and expensive furniture. I recognized it as the backdrop for many of her videos and found a camera already set up in the corner. She had left me a note, too, telling me to make myself at home and that she would be back at 11. The waiting was nerve-wracking. I took a seat on her luxurious couch and just sat there. My mind raced, going over possibilities and scenarios and making me a nervous wreck of anticipation. When the elevator finally came up to the penthouse, I felt a surge of excitement that my patience might finally pay off. She was framed in the elevator door as they opened, and it was the first time I'd ever met her in person. She wore a long tan coat and the same black boots she'd worn in her videos. Her shiny black hair was pulled back into its accustomed tail. As she stepped off the elevator, she let her coat puddle on the floor, and I could see her familiar black corset. She smiled when she saw me, and as I rose to greet her, she held out a finger, indicating me to stand and be quiet. She circled me, drinking me in with her eyes. The hungry way she looked at me made me both incredibly aroused and extremely uncomfortable. She was looking at me the way I look at a particularly tasty meal. Though this was certainly what I wanted, I had never seen someone look at another person that way before. She didn't say a word, just walked over to the camera and pointed it towards me. As she turned, I saw the red light was on. Looked like I was going to be in one of her movies tonight. "Don't worry," she said, her voice hinting at foreign places and exotic locales. "This is just for me. I'd never post anything online without your consent."
I smiled at her and started to disrobe, but she stopped me with a delicate finger. "Leave them on. I like to handle the clothes myself." She stepped away from me then, eyes smoldering as she held me in her gaze, and then something happened. If you've ever seen one of those old werewolf movies, the kind where their whole body shifts in a rapid and sudden transformation, then you may have some idea of what I saw. If not, I'll try to explain it as best I can. Her body seemed to ripple, her whole form shuddering like an image in a pond, and suddenly there was something else in front of me. Her body was a long mass of jade scales towering 12 feet high. As it reached its full height, it had to crouch to avoid hitting the ceiling, but this seemed to suit it just fine. It crouched to eye level, its spade-shaped head hovering inches from my body, and I realized that its eyes, those vast and hovering pools of death, were the same as hers. I was trapped by those eyes, like a bird before the snake, and when she struck, I never even had a chance to run. If you're reading this, then your next question must be, how am I even writing this? Being eaten is normally where the story like this would end, but unfortunately for me, it's not. Lady Dragora, that queen serpent of myth, has been dining on humans for a very long time, it would seem. She neither bit nor tore me. Instead, she struck with a precision born of years of practice and swallowed me whole with little effort. As I slid down her throat, I felt the slimy walls caress me and the suffocating darkness inviting me towards terror. She had let me keep my phone, however, and as I wiggled to get it, I could feel a new sensation coursing through the giant muscles that were her body, the squirming desire for more. That's when I realized what she wanted. She doesn't want a quick meal. She doesn't want a satisfying feed. She wants a terrified body to thrash and scream as her body does what it does best. She wants my last few hours to be her pleasure. So I've been sitting as still as I can for the last hour of my life, writing this message to the outside world. I've sent a copy to my friends at the coffee shop, a copy to the Chicago police, and I've posted a copy here, hoping that someone will read this and take it seriously. I now know what happened to Justin's missing friend, what likely happened to Justin himself, and the fate that awaits me at the end of my life. I want my death to be the last, though, so if you read this and you see her, don't fall for her games. Don't let yourself be another meal for Lady Dragora.
I sighed as I saw the toll booth looming up in front of us. My wife and I had driven down this road 1,000 times in the 10 years we'd been married. It was actually the place we took our first date, and we loved to drive down it on Sundays and feel nostalgic. Despite the number of times we've driven the long and winding route, the toll booth always surprises me a little. It sounds weird to say that our first date was a drive, but I think it was honestly pretty sweet. I'm a photographer, have been since I was 19, and I often shoot weddings and family photos for people in the area. I've got an amazing eye for location, and my photos have been featured in not just people's homes, but also in magazines that debut the beauty of North Georgia and the Carolinas. The Appalachians have been my home since I was born, and I know how to bring out her beauty in my photos. I was 22 and on my way to a wedding when I spotted a car on the side of the road with a young woman sitting on the hood. She waved her hands at me, asking if I would stop, and I rolled down my window to see if I could help. She said her car had broken down and was wondering if I could help her out. I'm no mechanic, and my car knowledge stops at changing my oil, so I offered her a ride to the wedding I was attending so she could call a wrecker. She agreed and ended up hanging out with me the whole wedding. The wrecker couldn't get there for 3 or 4 hours, and I was the only person that she knew. So, in between photo shoots, we talked. I got her some food. Weddings usually have a little extra, and this one was more of a country union than a black tie affair. We sat around and chatted as I took some candid shots. We discovered that we actually had a lot in common, and when the wrecker called her, she told him to just drop it off at her mechanic. I drove her home afterwards and invited her to dinner with me later that week. I know what you'll say, it wasn't a real date, but it meant something to us, and we've considered it our first date for years. We even went back on our first anniversary to put a marker where her card had broken down. It may be a little macabre, but We put a wreath there to commemorate her little coop. It had died on that spot the day we met. We still keep that wreath up. We stop at it sometimes so we can remember how we came to know each other. The spot where her car died is about 2 miles from the toll booth. The toll booth is an oddity. It's just a random toll booth out in the middle of the woods. You put 50 cents in the basket, the booth is never manned, and you head on your way. I have no idea who comes to collect the money. I don't imagine it makes a lot of it, but it's probably some senator's nest egg for when he gets put out of office. We always keep change in the car for just such an occasion, not minding paying a little toll to see the road that started our happy life. Today, however, I couldn't find 50 cents in the cup holder. It's been a busy week. We just put a down payment on our new house, my wife just started a new job, and I had just finished shooting a big wedding that more than paid for the down payment on the new house. But it left us a little light otherwise. We had cashed in our change jar that sat in the cup holder, something to get us by till payday, and I had forgotten to put more change in it afterwards for the toll road. The drive was kind of our date night this weekend. We had a picnic in the back seat, and we were going to go up to the lake where the wedding had been held. The lake was where we had our own wedding, and we went there often to picnic or swim or just enjoy a quiet afternoon together. "What's the matter?" Carol asked. I dug a nickel out from between the seats and weighed the pathetic little pile of change. 5 pennies, 2 dimes, and a nickel were all I had managed to find under the seats. The arm hung stoically across the road, little more than a wooden suggestion than a real barrier. I had thought many times that I could probably just drive through it and be done with the stupid thing, but such things were a little too rebellious for me. "You got any change?" I asked, doubting she did, but wanting to be sure. "No," she said, looking through her purse before exclaiming, "Aha!" and dropping another nickel onto my palm. "Well, it's a little better, but it's not quite 50 cents. Just dig some out of the change cup," she said. I shook the cup at her, reminding that we had recently traded it in. "Oh yeah. Well, what shall we do, my dear?" I considered turning around, maybe just forgetting the whole thing, but a new idea suddenly bubbled to the surface. I pulled onto the soft shoulder of the road, the car protesting as much as my wife. I'm sure my car's wheels were going to bog down any minute. The shoulder of the road is soft turf and seed grass, and I expected my tires would spew up earth and stick. I'd have to sheepishly explain to some highway patrolman how I'd gotten stuck then. To my surprise, though, I drove easily around the barrier. I laughed and wondered why I hadn't simply done this before. "What are you doing?" my wife asked, half laughing but also half aghast. "We've given this thing 50 cents loads of times. I think it can give us a pass, just this once." We both laughed as we drove away from the lonely little toll booth, but I think even then, I felt a slight twinge on the back of my neck. I would remember it later and realize I had been warned. We drove down the familiar road, taking in nature's bounty and chuckling at our daring. The trees were ablaze with early fall oranges and deep, healthy greens. The sky was a perfect robin's egg blue, and I just knew that the lake would be wonderful today. We could watch the sunset, maybe have a little fire before going home, and snuggling in bed at the end of a perfect day. It was a good plan, but someone had a different one, it seemed. As we drove, my wife watched the leaves with interest. My wife is an unofficial leaf looker, though she would never admit it, and our house has many pictures of beautiful foliage. As I drove, the roads winding onward, I saw her lift her head from the car window and squint at the passing colors. We were both getting on in years, no spring chickens now, but the look she was giving the leaves was decidedly prudish. It was like an old maid who simply can't believe Miss Tyler let her daughter out in that skirt. "John, does something seem off about the trees?" she asked, sounding perplexed. I looked at the trees, the oranges and reds and greens looking completely natural to me, and I told her so. It does, but it doesn't. It's like seeing trees on television. They look kind of glossy, recorded even. I don't know how to describe it. They just look a little weird. I brushed it off, thinking maybe she was seeing things. It had been a long week, and we had been through some pretty stressful times. It was enough to make anyone a little jangled. She kept watching the trees, but I'd put my eyes back on the road, wanting to be there already. We had driven for about another 30 minutes, though, when I had to slow down. Sitting in the road, white and brown with a glossy oak arm, was the toll booth. I stopped and looked around, thinking somebody might be playing a little joke, but there was no one around. The toll booth looked exactly as it had before. It was simulated wood grain, and the walls were painted a dark brown and creamy white. The arm was simulated oak with a glossy finish. It looked exactly like the toll booth, but it couldn't be. Could it? Maybe they thought they'd put up another one, my wife asked, smiling but clearly confused. I laughed a little at that. They were getting a little greedy out here, weren't they? I pulled around this one too, and I watched it disappear in the rearview mirror as we made our way down the road. My wife was still looking raptly at the trees as we drove past, her attention becoming unhealthy. When she asked me to take a look, I glanced over to see the unusual reds and oranges and greens, but something did look a little off about them. Had they become even more vibrant? The foliage looked artificial, almost neon, and it battered against my eyes as we watched them go past. Okay, there's no way you can tell me that was just my imagination. I didn't answer her. I just wanted to get to the lake so we could have our picnic and all would be normal again. This was weird, yeah, but it was just a strange phenomenon. We would make it to the lake and everything would be okay. When we drove here next weekend, or the weekend after that, everything would be just as it had always been. I edged my speed up a little, wanting to pass the weird technicolor trees and get into the deep woods I knew were coming. We had driven for about another half hour when my brakes screeched against the pavement. I blinked. It just couldn't be. I had been driving these roads for 10 years, and it was always just the one toll booth. My wife seemed startled too, leaning forward to look unbelievingly at the little booth. It looked exactly like the other two, but that was impossible. We had passed it twice, and I was sure there was only one toll booth out here. There would be no reason to think a second one would make any difference. There was so little traffic out here. What the hell? My wife asked. And when I pulled around the arm this time, it was a little more aggressively than I meant to. Maybe, she started, pausing a little as she looked nervously at me. Maybe we should just pay the toll. I didn't say anything. I had been too mad to even acknowledge the prickle on the back of my neck this time. Stupid, money-grubbing jerks. They hadn't figured they could line their pockets enough with just one toll booth, so they had to have two more. This was unbelievable. I had a sense of humor about the first one, but if they thought they were going to gouge me for another toll, babe, they had another thing coming. I was going to write my congressman, my senator. I'd write the freaking president about this. They couldn't just, John, gouge people like this. What about tourism? What about local beauty spots? What the hell happened to bringing people out so they could, John! I stopped on the brakes and turned to yell, "What?" at my wife as she stared out the window. Normally, she would have chastised me for yelling at her. I don't think I had yelled at her more than a couple of times our whole marriage, but she was too shaken to even take notice. She was looking out the window, staring at the trees with the strange leaves and pointing with a shaky finger. Look, she stuttered, and I turned to see what she was babbling about. The leaves were still eye-destroyingly bright, but this time they were also melting off the trees. Not regular melting either, but like wet paint dripping off an oversaturated object. I could see them dribbling onto the ground, pooling on the grass as the verdant green lawns became spin art. I put my eyes forward, racing the engine, and tried to reach what I knew was ahead as fast as I possibly could. The toll booth came into view again, but I didn't stop this time. What are you doing?" my wife said, getting nervous as I didn't slow down. I gunned the engine, revving to 70 on the straightaway. "Stop it. Stop. Don't do that." The engine growled as I nudged it up to 80. "John," my wife screamed, but it was too late. I crashed through the wooden arm and laughed maniacally as the wooden pieces cascaded off the hood and flew to either side. I had made a lot of mistakes that day, but damaging the booth, that was the worst one. My wife screeched when I hit the arm, but one look at me had reduced her to silence. I glanced over at her and immediately felt sorry for what I had done. My foot came off the ignition, and the car slowly spun to a stop in the middle of the two-lane road. I had damaged state property. I was sure there was some sort of camera on the booth somewhere, and it would be easy enough to see me ramming the arm. I thought about driving back to the booth and seeing if there was a number I could call to report the accident. But finally, I just decided to keep going, so we could make it to the lake before dark. As I drove, I realized my wife had been silent the whole time. I turned to tell her I was sorry, to apologize for going a little nuts back there, but she wasn't paying any attention to me at all. She was looking at the countryside as it rolled by. Honey, I'm sorry about all that. I just let it all get to me. I'm sorry for yelling. Sorry for acting like a psycho. I was just so... The trees are wrong, John. Her voice sounded on the edge of hysteria. What? I asked, craning my neck around. They're all dead. They're all dead, John. I turned right, wanting to see what she was talking about. But when I saw the trees, I wasn't sure why it had taken me so long to see. The trees, so vibrant and colorful before, were now sickly and forlorn. The vibrant colors had oozed right out of them, and the leaves hung limply from the trees as their bark hung pale and peeling. It wasn't just the trees either. The sky looked yellow and sick. It made no sense. What the hell was going on? This was nothing like how the road usually was. It was nothing like how it had looked the first time we'd seen the toll booth. I put my foot down on the ignition and we kept rolling forward towards our destination. It only got weirder the longer we drove. The longer we drove, the more I expected to run into that toll booth again. The longer I drove and didn't encounter that ramshackled booth, the more paranoid I became. The world outside didn't help much either. The sky became darker and darker as we went. The leaves began to drop from the trees in droves. The limbs were skeletal, the bark crumbling from the long, fragile limbs, and the farther we traveled, the more desiccated they became. We should have come to the deep woods by now. We should have come to the lake by now. We should have seen another car, seen a deer, seen something. My wife stopped looking out the window, and I kept sneaking glances at her to make sure she was okay. She just sat hunkered against the seat, rubbing her shoulders as she tried not to notice what was going on outside. I should have been worried about her. I should have stopped to make sure she was okay, but I was feeling on the verge of mental collapse myself. We never made it to our destination, little as I would have wanted to get out if we had. As the sun began to set, I realized how much worse it could get. Honey, I whispered, not sure how long it had been since we'd spoken. It felt like days, weeks, but my mind railed against this idea. We were just a little lost on a road we had driven so many times we could have set the mile markers. I wasn't sure what was going on here, but I was sure that we would come out of it okay. We shouldn't have driven around it. What? I asked, confused by her answer. We shouldn't have hurt the toll booth. She turned towards me and she looked afraid. We should have just paid the toll. Now it's mad, and it might never let us get off this road. That's nonsense, I said. But it lacked conviction. I had been out here at night before, driving home after a day on the lake, but I had never seen it this dark. The trees no longer looked to be the old pines that I'd come to love. The trees I could see from the headlights looked more like maples, with a thick, dark sap running out of them. If I looked too long at them, some of them even seemed to have faces. I always looked away when I noticed this, afraid to meet their gaze, but I could feel them looking at me nonetheless, challenging me to meet their eyes. As much as I wanted to tell her she was wrong, I couldn't argue the fact that we seemed to be stuck, and it had all started after we drove around the toll booth. Quick, dig under the seat and see if you can find 15 cents. She looked at me in disbelief. What? 15 cents? That way, if we see the toll booth again, we can pay the toll and get out of here, I nearly growled at her. She moved slowly, like someone in a dream. She began to search under the seats for change, and as she searched, I kept driving. I was beginning to believe that something outside the norm might be at play here, and the further we drove, the more I also believed that we were being followed. The moon hung overhead, the bright yellow moon like a kid's Halloween drawing, and by that popcorn yellow beam, I could see things running through the woods. They loped along like big dogs, their bodies oddly elongated, and their legs thick and long. I never got more than a quick look at them, but that look was enough. I think I see a quarter in the track of the seat, but I can't get it. Can you pull over so I can reach it? I gritted my teeth, but quarter would get us there for sure. I pulled over slowly, my lights still glaring into the woods, and told her to please be quick. My wife stepped out, getting down beside the car so she could reach below the seat. I glanced around nervously, watching the woods for signs of the creatures. My wife was saying how she almost had it, but it kept slipping through her fingers. I told her to be quick, and when I looked back at the tree line, I saw one. It was like a mountain lion that had been dipped in tar. It was like a massive cat, with black ridges of overlapping plates. I imagined I could see the headlights reflected off its grinning mouth full of razor-sharp teeth, and its claws clicked impatiently on the edge of the pavement. "Carol," I whispered, not taking my eyes off the creatures. "I've almost got it," she growled through gritted teeth. The creature didn't seem to have eyes, but its head turned menacingly towards the car as Carol spoke. As the quarter came free, I reached down and grabbed her by the collar of her t-shirt, lifting her into the car. My wife isn't large, maybe 5 feet, but at that moment it wouldn't have mattered if she'd been a giant. I pulled her back into the car and pushed my foot down on the accelerator as hard as I could, the door bumping shut as we got back on the road. If I had hesitated even a moment longer, we'd likely be dead. As it was, I clipped the beastie in the side of the head instead of full in the side. The chest of the creature would have caved the front of my car in, but its head whipped heavily to the side as it broke one of the headlights. I barely noticed as I flew down the road at 70, the other creatures in hot pursuit. We were doing 90 as we barreled forward, but I could see the pack of nightmare hounds right behind us. The rear lights lit their chitinous faces hellishly, and I took the hairpin turns with wheel-screeching accuracy. I'm no NASCAR driver, but the sight of those creatures behind me was enough to push me onward. If they caught me, we'd both be dead. If I crashed, we'd both be dead anyway. Seemed like either way, our options were pretty limited. They followed us for a long while, too long for creatures their size. I was driving 90 most of the time, but they kept pace as easy as if I'd been going 20. I was keeping ahead of them, but only just. I felt them bump the back bumper more than once. They seemed intent on forcing me off the road, but they couldn't quite hit hard enough to force me off. My wife shuddered every time we got hit, and I found myself barely able to keep it on the road after every successful strike. After some indiscriminate amount of time, I looked in the rearview mirror to find that we were alone again. A few minutes later, I saw the toll booth come up into view, but not the one I was used to seeing. This toll booth was black, the paneling looking like the skin on those creatures, and the arm looked like an unprocessed tree trunk. I didn't hesitate. I dropped the money into the basket, whispering sorry as the arm slid up to permit us. We pulled through the turnstile, and it was like crossing some kind of barrier into another world. My grandmother had grown up in Ireland, and had sometimes told me stories about people who crossed the barrier between their world and into the realm of Fae. Grandma always said that people could cross into the fairy realm without realizing it, but I knew all too well when I crossed the border out of whatever place we had been in. It was like passing under the coldest waterfall I could imagine. We got home without incident, but it's the craziest thing. We had voicemails from our friends, a client, and even my wife's new job, asking where we were and why we'd been gone for so long. It seemed that even though we had left just after lunch on Sunday, we didn't return till Tuesday night. The car's still damaged, so I know we didn't imagine it. The car is damn near out of gas, and the oil shows that it's almost due for an oil change, despite having been done less than a month ago. I don't know what the hell happened to us, but I know I'll be keeping money in the cup holder from now on. Whether we ever choose to go down that road again or not, I will always have money to feed the toll booths that may appear in my life. You never know where they might take you if you don't play by the rules. Driving is easily the most boring part of my job. I work as a salesman for an all-in-one printer company. Business has been slow the last couple of years, with the rise of personal printers, but our loyal customer base has really helped us get through these troubling times. That's why I was in Garrison and Marco's attorney at law that day. I'd been trying to sell them on the latest color all-in-one model to replace their current one, which was a few years old. They had sent me back to the office with a "we'll think about it," and I had started my 4-hour drive back to said office. That's how I came to be on the highway behind the truck in the first place. The sun was setting when I left the law firm. By the time I got on the highway, it was already dark. I mingled with the other cars as we merged in with the big rigs that made the interstate their home. I was behind a particularly large 18-wheeler when I first noticed the thing. It started out as a reflection. Have you ever noticed how an animal's eyes will reflect the light? Well, it was like that. I was sitting behind him with my low beams on when I noticed the sparkle from underneath the trailer. It was 3 or 4 small reflective points, and in my mind, I sort of obsessed over it. What could possibly be making those reflections? Some sort of axle? Maybe something ornamental that the driver had stuck under this truck. It probably seems silly to obsess over something like that as you sit reading my story. But when you're stuck in traffic on the interstate, your mind searches for all sorts of things to occupy your time. Whatever it was midway between the front wheels and the back wheels, too far under the truck for me to really make it out. I didn't think it was alive or anything, but it was a fun little mystery. I was stuck in gridlock. Some wreck up the way had brought us to a halt, and as I adjusted the radio in the beat-up old car that gave the salesman a drive, I found my eyes returning to that thing again and again. My brain just wouldn't leave it alone, and I began to create reasons for the thing to be under there. Maybe it was for stability. Maybe it was something he had put under there so people didn't hit the back of the trailer in the middle of the night. Maybe it was just one of those stupid things that people often hook to their trucks just because they can. Whatever it was, my mind had decided to obsess over it. I was watching it when my cell phone rang, and as I fished it out of my pocket, I found my eyes rising to see the thing as I said hello. "So, can we go ahead and put them down for a new printer?" the boss asked. They said they'd have to think about it, but they also said there's nothing wrong with their current printer, so I wouldn't expect to see any orders from them. Damn, I was really counting on offloading a couple of these to the firm. Did you tell them about the added features? Of course I did, sir. And I was about to tell him that I was no rookie salesman when I looked up and almost dropped the phone. The thing I had been focused on for the last 20 miles had moved. It was subtle, but when you've been staring at it for as long as I had, you notice these things. The thin fiber filament had shifted somehow, and the pattern had changed. I was almost sure of it. I could hear my boss asking if I was still there, and I assured him that I was. I told him I would be back in the office in a few hours, and he told me just to head home. I could turn in my reports tomorrow. Sounds like you could use the sleep. You're sounding a little jittery. I thanked him and told him I'd see him tomorrow, before hanging up the phone and looking back at the thing under the truck. I could also see 6 surfaces reflected back at me now, instead of the 4 I had seen a moment ago. They looked even more like eyes. Whatever wreck there was up ahead, they must have cleared it out of the way. We were suddenly moving along again at a brisk pace, and I was glad for the shift in speed. My mind had suddenly turned what looked like some kind of ornament into something dangerous, and I really wanted to be from behind this truck. There was no chance of getting around them, though. The traffic was still pretty tight, and I was pretty well trapped behind this 18-wheeler and the 18-wheeler beside me. So for the next 2 hours we drove, the most nerve-wracking 2 hours of my life. The longer we drove, the more I was convinced that it was no optical illusion. Whatever was under there was definitely moving, and it had quite a few legs that I could see. It was using 2 of the thinner ones to hold itself under the truck, and the other 6 or 8, or maybe even as many as 10, were anchoring it to the truck itself. What was worse were all those reflective surfaces that I still thought of as eyes. They were staring straight at me the whole time, and I began to believe that it knew I could see it. I shook my head the first time I thought this. I was tired, I had had too much coffee, and I was just seeing things. These were the excuses that ran around and around inside my head, like a dog chasing his tail. I didn't want to believe that I was stuck behind a truck, carrying a very different sort of cargo. I wanted to believe that I was just seeing things, and I was making things up to pass the time. That sort of delusion only lasted until the thing moved closer. You see, the longer I watched it, the longer it watched me. I don't know if it knew I could see it, but it didn't seem to like the level of scrutiny I was giving it. It was midway between the cab, watching me like a predator watching its prey. The longer it went on, the less safe I felt inside my car. Something that big could surely get through the window, or break the windshield, and I would have nowhere to go in this gridlock. But I was still trying to be rational, trying to be realistic. There was no way that whatever it was alive. It was a trick of the light. It was my mind playing tricks on me. When I finally got home, safe behind the door of my apartment, I would laugh about how silly I had been, and feel really stupid. I was a grown man behind the wheel of a car, jumping at shadows. I began to use this idea as a security blanket, wrapping myself in it so I didn't just go crazy right there behind the wheel of my car. That was when it moved. The reflective eyes shifted suddenly. I don't mean that they blinked or anything. I mean they shifted. One minute I was looking at it, and the next it was sliding beneath the underside of the trailer. Suddenly those eyes were coming closer. They were less than 10 feet away from my car now, peering from under the trailer at me as I tried to maintain my speed. I know how that sounds, but it's the truth. Whatever it was had finally gotten tired of being watched, and had decided to get closer. I felt a sudden stirring of primal fear. This must have been how early man had felt when it encountered something it just didn't understand, when it saw the long teeth and heard the growl of some unknown predator, when it saw the all-too-intelligent eyes of an animal that was a little too human reflected in the darkness, when it came to realize that the safety of its cave could also be a trap. I imagine that it felt just as helpless as I did now. Helpless, but intent on survival. I tried again to convince myself that I was being silly. This was nothing more than a trick of the light, some errant spiderweb under the cab that my headlights were catching that just now came loose and was presenting itself as some sort of boogeyman for me to be afraid of. I suddenly knew how to alleviate this fear. I would flip my high beams on. The high beams would show me the underside of the truck, and I could see that the source of my fears was nothing at all. I reached for the switch, my hands much less steady than I thought they should be, my fingers wrapping around the knob. For a moment, I just couldn't bring myself to turn the switch. Did I really want to know? Did I really want this thing to know that I knew? Once the monster in the closet knows that you know it's there, does it have any choice but to eat you? I shook my head and flipped the switch on. I know now that I shouldn't have done that. What was under the cab was no spider web, but it was the monster I had feared it was. It was a spider the size of a large dog. It was easily 4.5 feet tall, and it was hunkered beneath the trailer's cluster of wheels. It looked at me upside down, with its legs clinging to the metal, its fangs dripping some translucent liquid and clicking together very fast. It made a high, angry sound that I could hear from behind my closed windows, and the look it gave me on its far too expressive face was terrifying. My brain seemed to give me a choice between fight or flight, and in my cowardice, I chose flight. I pulled around the truck, pulling onto the soft shoulder of the road, and drove around it and the line of angry cars. Fortunately, there were no police officers in that line. There was an exit ramp not too terribly far from the truck, and I whipped into the on-ramp and pulled away from the highway into the small gas station about a mile later. It took me nearly 30 minutes to make my breath regular, expecting that spider creature to attack my car any minute. When I had control of myself again, I drove home. It took an extra hour, but I took side roads and back ways the whole way. So often in these stories, there's a moment of horror that comes afterward. Some accident, a truck found abandoned on the side of the road, a dead body in the truck stop, but there was none of that for me. I never heard a news report alluding to anything strange or out of the ordinary. I could almost forget about it until I close my eyes and see those far too expressive eyes looking at me as the high beams pin it to the underside and their lights. I take back roads whenever I travel now, avoiding the highway at all costs. I avoid big rigs as well. I don't ever want to see anything like that again.